Welcome to Group Two's presentation of category-based and feature-based bias. This group includes Megan Barnes, Cynthia Goodman, and myself, Sharon Hill. This presentation will follow the outlined agenda, beginning with foundational information about bias, including a review of key relevant terms and supporting information about the topic. We will also cover bias across school and clinical settings, as well as topic-related implications for counselor educators. To open this examination, let's consider the question of why is bias awareness vital for counselors and counselor educators? The following areas are important to this discussion, including awareness and improved diagnostic objectivity. Bias awareness also mitigates misdiagnosis and harm to clients, as well as it preserves the therapeutic alliance. Each of these areas support counselor competence in accordance with the ACA Codes of Ethics. The historical perspective of bias research. Historically, according to authors Johnson and Geisinger, the impetus for bias research stemmed from the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Within their text, they wrote that bias research in the United States began to combat institutional discrimination following the Civil Rights Act. The authors further explained that bias in counseling was initially researched to broaden the scope of counseling beyond its focus on white males and to expose and correct other systemic injustices, thereby improving overall treatment efficacy. Discussion question. Have you ever noticed how one's particular characteristics can unconsciously influence people's decisions? While considering this question, please take a moment to recall enjoying your freedoms as an individual, to do things like playing in a park during childhood, or to spend a quiet evening in the privacy of your home enjoying a bowl of ice cream. Perhaps even finally driving home after a long day of work. As Americans, it is easy to take for granted the relative safety of these activities and similar mundane scenarios. However, it is documented far too often that doing any of these things as an African American could lead to harmful and even deadly outcomes based upon the bias of others, such as in the cases of Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio, Botham Jean in Dallas, Texas, and Sandra Bland in Prairie View, Texas, to name a few. In addition, an article published by the Innocence Project highlighted their mission to free the innocent, prevent wrongful convictions, and create fair, compassionate, and equitable systems of justice for everyone. With a strong commitment to combat bias and to promote social justice, the group in the Innocence Project group, wrote an article which underscores the critical importance of their mission with the reporting of some key devastating facts. Arguably, the most disturbing of the statistics reported within this article was that Black people account for 40% of approximately 2.3 million incarcerated people in the United States and nearly 50% of all exonerees, despite the fact that they make up just 13% of the U.S. population. Also, the point was made that of 232 people who this group worked to exonerate and to secure the release for to date, 2/3 of that group were people of color, and of that amount, 52% of them were Black. Considering each of these examples of the pervasive and destructive impact of bias, as well as the content of Chapter 24 of our course textbook by Casas et al. This review of the topic of bias is relevant to current and future helping professionals, including counselors and counselor educators. For the sake of counselor and counselor supervisor competency, it is vital that we establish conceptual understanding of bias in general, as well as category-based and feature-based bias as a distinct and related process involved in racial bias and their significant impact on African Americans as described and emphasized by Casas et al. 2017. Bias is defined generally as a partiality, inclination, or predisposition for or against something. It is an attitude, belief, or feeling that results in and supports an unjust or differential treatment of individuals and groups based on characteristics like race, gender, age, or socioeconomic status. Implicit bias is defined as a negative attitude or learned association against a specific social group that operates prior to conscious intention or awareness. For example, unconscious racism or unconscious sexism. Explicit bias is defined as a negative attitude against a specific social group that is consciously held, where the person is aware of their prejudice and can openly report or acknowledge it. In Chapter 24 of our textbook, Casas et al. Explain that bias consists of processes operating at multiple levels: cognitive, affective, and behavioral levels. The authors explain that categorizing people into social groups is a precursor to many forms of bias. As such, stereotyping is a cognitive level process in which people make inferences about individuals based upon their group membership to a certain social group. Prejudice is a negative affective reaction to an individual based on their group membership. Discrimination is a behavioral reaction to an individual based on their belonging to a certain social group. Understanding those terms, let's define category-based and feature-based bias. Category-based bias is the tendency to categorize information or data into meaningful groups, such as people, objects, and animals, for example, based on certain characteristics. As humans, we exist in a complex world and therefore have developed strategies to manage the vast amounts of information that we are required to process during our lives. Categorization is one of those strategies. According to the dual model and the continuum model, when people encounter and make judgments of a new individual, they often automatically categorize that person into a particular social group based often solely on visible physical features in accordance with the mental representations of the many social groups that they hold. Once people categorize and target a person into a specific social group, they then form their impressions of that person based on the stereotypes associated with the social group to which that target person was categorized, as well as their attitudes toward that group of people. Thereby, if that person's beliefs about and attitudes toward the social group are negative, so will their beliefs and attitudes toward the target person. This process results in category-based racial bias. And lastly, feature-based bias is, is a strategy driven by specific, isolated traits, details, or characteristics of an object or individual rather than the overall group membership. Whereas automatic categorization of people into social groups is a normal perceptual process for effective navigation of everyday life, it can, it can have negative consequences when when impression formation is overgeneralized. Casas et al. Explained that these models of impression formation are directly correlated with bias toward African Americans. Common Afrocentric features shared by many African Americans are typically used to categorize them. These features include darker skin and eye color, wider nose, thicker lips, and coarse hair. Once the target person is categorized as African American, he or she is subjected to stereotypes associated with the social group African American, as well as negative evaluations of the group. This process results in feature-based bias. Now, with greater understanding of key terms and concepts associated with our topic, we will continue our examination of category and feature-based bias. Cynthia?
Thank you, Sharon. Now that we've introduced the concepts in Chapter 24, I want to focus on something critical for counselors: how category based and feature based bias actually operate in real client work. These aren't abstract ideas, they show up in assessment, diagnosis, treatment planning, and how we interpret what our clients tell us. So let's explore why this matters and what it looks like when bias influences our practice. Over the next few minutes, we will look closely at research, case data, and empirical evidence that show how these cognitive mechanisms shape real assessments and client outcomes in our everyday practice. Let's start with the framework from Casas. The authors make a clear point: bias may occur because of group membership or because of characteristics associated with group membership. When counselors don't recognize these forms of bias, three things happen. First, we misdiagnose. We label behavior as pathology when it's actually a normal response to discrimination. Second, we miss cultural context. We don't understand the lived experiences that shape how clients show up in our office. Third, we fail to provide culturally responsive care. We treat the symptoms instead of the whole person. This is why Casa and his colleagues say recognizing these biases is essential. It's not optional, it directly affects how we help our clients. The textbook begins with the case of Trayvon Martin to illustrate how category based bias can shape our perceptions before we know anything about a person. Trayvon Martin was a 17-year-old black teenager who was walking home from a convenience store carrying candy and a drink. He was unarmed, and yet he was fatally shot after being perceived as a threat. The authors use this case to show how quickly assumptions can form. Before Trayvon spoke, before anyone knew his story, judgments had already been made. His race, the hoodie he was wearing, and the environment which he was seeing became cues that influenced how he was perceived. For many Black Americans, this case represented more than a single tragic event. It reflected a broader reality that everyday activities, such as walking home, going to the store, or simply being present in a neighborhood, can be viewed through the lens of racial bias. The fear is that ordinary behavior may be misinterpreted because assumptions tied to race. The authors use this example to demonstrate category based bias at its most harmful. Although the consequences in counseling are very different, the same psychological process can occur in helping professions. Counselors, like everyone else, can make automatic assumptions about clients based on race, ethnicity, gender, or other aspects of social identity. Recognizing these unconscious biases is the first step to providing culturally responsive and equitable care. Let's take a moment to clearly define these two types of bias again. Category based bias occurs when our perceptions are influenced by a person's social group membership. This includes characteristics such as race, ethnicity, gender, religion, sexual orientation, or disability status. Instead of seeing the individual first, our brains automatically categorize them based on the group they belong to. Feature based bias, on the other hand, is influenced by specific characteristics rather than group membership. So these include skin tone, hair texture, an accent, facial features, clothing, or even the way someone communicates. Without realizing it, our brains attach automatic meaning or assumptions to these features. The key points, though, that CASA makes is that both types of bias can influence our work with clients, even when we genuinely value fairness, equity, and cultural responsiveness. This means that bias is not simply about being a good or bad person. Rather, it's about reflecting on ways our brains process information based on our experiences, socialization, and repeated exposure to cultural messages. The first step towards becoming a more effective and culturally responsive counselor is recognizing that these automatic biases exist and intentionally working to reduce their influence. So, how do we know if bias is operating and people aren't consciously aware of it? Researchers have developed indirect measures. These tools don't ask you directly, they measure automatic associations. The IAT test is an implicit association test, pairing images and words rapidly and measuring reaction times. Slower rates indicate slower associations. The sequential priming task uses word fragments and priming. The weapon identification task shows images and asks people to identify objects quickly. And the first person shooter task is a simulation where people decide whether to shoot based on images. What all of these reveal is that people have automatic associations that they may not consciously recognize. And those associations influence how quickly we react, what we see, and what we do. This is why implicit bias training is important for counselors. We can't change what we don't see, but once we see it, we can work with it. Let me share a recent case that shows why this topic matters. It happened in Hartford, Connecticut in 2026. Stephen Jones was a 55-year-old man experiencing a mental health crisis. Concerned about his safety, his sister called 911, and when the officers arrived, three of them spent several minutes trying to de escalate the situation. They spoke to him calmly, worked to build rapport, and used less lethal tactics. Stephen was holding a large knife, appeared disoriented, and was hurting himself, but the officer continued to try to bring the situation under control. Then a first officer arrived, and everything changed. He immediately began shouting commands, and within 30 seconds of getting there, he fired 9 shots. Stephen later died from his injuries. After investigating the incident, Connecticut Inspector General concluded that the shooting was not justified. The report found that the fourth officer didn't continue the de escalation efforts that were already working, but instead he escalated the situation. This case makes us stop and think. What changed? The officer saw a man in crisis who needed to be de escalated. The fourth officer responded differently. We can't know exactly what influenced the response, but the case reminds us of how quickly our perceptions and our assumptions can shape the decisions we make. That's why understanding category based bias is so important, especially in helping professions where our judgments directly affect other people's lives. Look at the two responses. With category based bias operating, the assessment is immediate threat, dangerous, aggressive. The response is escalation and force. The outcome is death. The first three officers had a different assessment. They saw a person in crisis. They recognized he needed mental health support, not force. They de escalated. Their response was care. Their outcome was that Stephen was still alive when the fourth officer arrived. Same situation, different perception, different assessment, different outcome. This is category based bias. The person's race shaped how the fourth officer's perceived threat. It shaped his assessment of danger, and it shaped his response. For counselors, the question is this: are we doing the same thing? Are we perceiving threat where there is a pain? Are we assessing dangerousness when there is distress? Are we pathologizing where there is culture? Now let's look at feature based bias. This example involves Darryl George. He's 18 years old. He's a black student in Texas. He wore natural dreadlocks to school. School administrators said his hair violated dress code. His locks fell below his eyebrows and his earlobe, so they said it was against policy for male students. Here's the context. Texas passed the Crown Act in 2023. Crown stands for Creating a Respectful and Open World for Natural Hair. It explicitly protects natural hair, protective hairstyles, and hair texture. So, despite these legal protections, Darryl George was suspended multiple times. He filed a lawsuit. The discrimination continued despite the law. This is feature based bias. His hair texture, his style, his appearance triggered a perception of violation. Not because of anything he did, not because of who he is as a person, but because of how he looks. Let's look at the two responses again. With feature based bias, the assumption is that something is unprofessional. The focus becomes change in his appearance. The message is implicit: change who you are. The outcome is suspension, dropout, a young person who leaves school. A culturally responsive approach is different. It explores identity. It acknowledges that hair is cultural expression, not a violation. It supports authenticity. The outcome is that the students stayed engaged. Same hair, different perception, different assessment, different outcome. For counselors, ask yourself, when a client shows up looking different than I expect, what's my automatic thought? When a client dresses differently, speaks with an accent, wears their hair in protective styles, how do I perceive them? Am I making assumptions about professionalism, about capability, about who they are? These are the questions to sit with. Real questions, not rhetorical. Am I making assumptions based on appearance or group membership? Notice what you think when a client walks in. What comes up for you when they are speaking? Am I pathologizing normal cultural responses? When a client talks about hypervigilance, about not trusting authority, about protecting themselves, am I hearing it as an anxiety disorder, or am I hearing it as a survival response to discrimination? Am I asking about cultural identity and lived experience? Do I know what a person's daily life looks like? Do I know what they've been through? Or am I making assumptions based on their appearance? Am I honoring cultural expression or asking clients to assimilate? When a client makes a choice about how they present themselves, am I supporting that or am I subtly pushing them towards what feels safe to me? These questions matter. They reveal where bias is operating. So, what does culturally responsive practice look like? First, make the client's cultural identity and lived experience an essential part of the counseling process. Second, recognize and build on the client's strengths and resilience instead of focusing only on the problems. Third, explore how racism, discrimination, and cultural identity may influence mental health. Ask respectful questions that help you better understand your client's experiences. Finally, support clients in expressing their authentic selves by creating a space where they feel respected, understood, and valued. Ultimately, culturally responsive practice shifts our focus from seeing only symptoms and diagnoses to understanding the whole person, including their culture, strengths, and their lived experiences. Here's the key takeaway: bias doesn't just influence how we see clients, it shapes how we interpret their experiences, make diagnoses, develop treatment plans, and ultimately affect client outcomes. When counselors don't recognize category based and feature based bias, we risk misunderstanding our clients and overlooking the cultural context that is essential to effective counseling. Recognizing these biases is a critical part of culturally responsive practice and in building a strong therapeutic relationship. But bias doesn't only affect clients, it also influences counselor education and the profession itself. It can shape who receives support, who has access to quality supervision, and who is given opportunities to grow and lead. Those questions about bias in counselor training, supervision, and professional development are what Megan will discuss next. Megan?
Based and feature based bias influence the experiences of clients, students, and communities. As future counselor educators and supervisors, we have an additional responsibility. We must consider how the same forms of bias influence the counselors we train. Think about the decisions counselor educators make throughout a student's development. We participate in admissions decisions, we evaluate classroom performance, we supervise practicum and internship experiences, we make remediation recommendations, we engage in gatekeeping, we ultimately help determine who enters the counseling profession and who advances within it. The questions on this slide are important because they move us from thinking about bias as something that only affects clients to recognizing the bias can also affect counselors in training. Who becomes a counselor? Who succeeds in training? And who advances in the profession? The answers to those questions are not always based solely on competence. The examples we discussed demonstrate how quickly assumptions can shape perceptions. In the Trayvon Martin case, assumptions about race influence perceptions of threat. In the Darryl George case, assumptions about appearance influence perceptions of professionalism. As counselor educators and supervisors, we must ask ourselves whether similar assumptions can influence how we evaluate counselors in training. As Chapter 24 reminds us, judgments can be influenced by both category-based and feature-based bias. If we fail to recognize those influences, they can affect opportunities, evaluations, and professional development long before a counselor begins independent practice. One of the most important responsibilities of counselor educators and supervisors is evaluation. We are expected to assess competence fairly and accurately. However, Chapter 24 again reminds us that bias can influence those evaluations. Category-based bias occurs when assumptions are made because of membership in a social group. For example, a supervisor might unconsciously assume a supervisee lacks empathy, is more aggressive, or is a poor fit because of race, gender, religion, disability status, or another aspect of identity. Feature-based bias operates differently. Instead of focusing on group membership, judgments are influenced by characteristics associated with a group. Examples include accent, dialect, skin tone, hairstyle, communication style, or appearance. Notice that the concerns listed on this slide are not actual counseling competencies, they are perceptions. Someone may be viewed as unprofessional, lacking confidence, or a poor communicator based on characteristics that have little to do with counseling effectiveness. The potential outcomes are significant. Bias may contribute to lower evaluations, increased remediation concern, reduced opportunities, or the perception that a supervisee has competency deficits when the issue is actually cultural difference rather than lack of skill. Consider the following scenario. A supervisor rates an intern lower on professional communication after a single session. The intern has strong client outcomes and positive peer feedback. However, the supervisor notes that the intern has a heavy accent and does not maintain consistent eye contact. Take a moment to think about what additional information would be needed before making an evaluation. Would you want more direct observation? Would you want client outcome data? Would you want feedback from multiple evaluators? Or would you want all of the above? Pause for a moment and consider your response. As counselor educators and supervisors, we are expected to make decisions based on evidence rather than assumptions. Before labeling a supervisee as struggling, we must gather enough information to ensure our conclusions are supported by observable performance rather than personal impressions. Let's continue with a more detailed example. Jordan is a counseling intern who demonstrates strong client outcomes, positive relationships with both clients and peers, effective case conceptualization, and consistent documentation. Objectively, Jordan appears to be meeting expectations. However, the supervisor expresses concerns about Jordan's strong accent, limited eye contact, and quiet communication style. As you look at this example, ask yourself what evidence actually supports the supervisor's concern. Is there evidence that Jordan is ineffective with clients? Is there evidence of ethical concerns? Is there evidence of poor clinical skills? Or are communication differences being interpreted as competency concerns? This is where Chapter 24 becomes highly relevant. Category-based and feature-based bias often emerge in situations where subjective impressions are given greater weight than observable evidence. So who defines professionalism? This may be one of the most important questions in counselor education and supervision. What does a professional counselor look like? What does a professional counselor sound like? And who establishes those standards? Many of us have been socialized to associate professionalism with specific behaviors such as direct eye contact, particular speech patterns, certain hairstyles, emotional restraint, or a specific level of assertiveness. We saw this dynamic in the Darryl George case discussed earlier. School officials viewed his hairstyle as violating professional and behavioral expectations despite legal protections under the Crown Act. That example reminds us that professionalism is not always a neutral concept. Expectations about appearance are often influenced by culture, history, and power. The challenge is that many of these expectations are culturally influenced. For example, eye contact may be interpreted differently across cultures. Communication styles vary across communities. Hair and appearance may carry important cultural meaning. If we are not careful, professionalism can become a proxy for cultural familiarity. In other words, we may evaluate individuals more favorably when they look, speak, and behave in ways that align with dominant cultural norms. That is exactly why feature-based bias is so important. This is not competence. The issue is how competence is being interpreted. The ACA Code of Ethics reminds us that supervision, training, and teaching carry significant ethical responsibilities. Counselor educators are responsible for fair evaluation, due process, cultural responsiveness, student development, and client welfare. What is important here is that ethical supervision requires more than simply following procedures. It requires ongoing self-examination. If bias influences evaluation, then fairness is compromised. If cultural differences are mistaken for competency concerns, due process is compromised. If assumptions influence gatekeeping decisions, student development is compromised. The situations we discussed earlier involving Trayvon Martin, Stephen Jones, and Darryl George all illustrate what can happen when assumptions are treated as facts. While counselor education described decisions are very different from those situations, the underlying lesson is the same. When perceptions go unexamined, real consequences follow. Section F of the ACA Code of Ethics exists in part to ensure that evaluations are based on professional standards rather than personal preferences. The ethical question we must continually ask ourselves is this: am I evaluating competence or am I evaluating cultural familiarity? Reducing bias through supervision and program design is essential. Awareness is important, but awareness alone is not enough. If programs are serious about reducing bias, they must create systems that support fair evaluation. One strategy is the use of structured evaluation rubrics. Rubrics help ensure that supervisors evaluate observable behaviors rather than relying on feelings or impressions. A second strategy is the use of multiple evaluators. Faculty supervisors, site supervisors, and other professionals may provide valuable perspectives that reduce the impact of individual bias. Program-wide data review is also important. Counselor educators should regularly examine evaluation patterns to determine whether certain groups are being flagged, remediated, or evaluated differently. Finally, supervision should be informed by the MSJCC, or the Multicultural and Social Justice Counseling Competencies. Supervisors should consistently examine their own cultural assumptions and how those assumptions may influence their evaluations. Bias reduction is not simply an individual responsibility, it is a program responsibility. The Multicultural and Social Justice Counseling Competencies provide a practical framework for addressing bias in counselor education. The first area is self-awareness. Supervisors must understand their own cultural values, assumptions, and biases. The second area is awareness of others. Supervisors must consider the cultural experiences and identities of supervisees. The third area is relationship awareness. This requires understanding of how power, privilege, and positionality influence the supervisory relationship. Finally, there's advocacy. Counselor educators and supervisors have a responsibility to challenge systemic patterns that create inequitable outcomes. These competencies move us beyond awareness and toward action. Before your next evaluation, I encourage you to pause and consider these questions. Am I rating the intern against a clinical standard or a cultural familiarity standard? Am I interpreting communication styles as a competency concern without behavioral evidence? Have I examined how my own background shapes what I read as professional presence? And am I prepared to advocate within this program if I see a pattern across multiple interns? These questions are not always comfortable, but they are necessary. Bias often operates most powerfully when it goes unquestioned. That theme has appeared throughout every example discussed today. Whether the bias involves race, appearance, communication style, or cultural expression, the common thread was that assumptions influence perception. As counselor educators and supervisors, our responsibility is to ensure that evidence drives evaluation rather than assumptions. As we conclude, I want to leave you with 3 reflections. First, where in my evaluations might features be doing the work that evidence should? Second, who is not advancing in my program, on my caseload, or within my organization, and why? And finally, what will I examine this week that I have not examined before? The central message of Chapter 24 is that bias does not begin and end with the client. It can travel through the counselor, the supervisor, and the training program itself. The cases discussed earlier demonstrated how category-based and feature-based bias can influence perceptions in schools, communities, and systems. The challenge for counselor educators is ensuring those same biases do not quietly influence admissions decisions, supervision, remediation, or gatekeeping. As future counselor educators and supervisors, our responsibility is not simply to recognize bias. Our responsibility is to create systems, supervision practices, and educational experiences that actively reduce its influence. Thank you for engaging with us on this important topic. Category-based and feature-based bias are operating right now in counseling and education settings, and naming them precisely is what makes intervention possible. The research we shared today is not the full picture. We encourage you to go deeper into Chapter 24 and to follow the data on school discipline and clinical disparities as it continues to develop. The questions on the previous slides are the ones we carry with us into our own practice and supervision as counselor educators. We hope you carry them into yours as well. Thank you.